If someone asked me how it feels to be judged before they even know your name, I tell them, it's like walking into a storm you didn't cause. I was raised by a hardworking single mother in a quiet part of Nigeria, where dignity was a person's only inheritance. So when I fell in love with Emeka, the wealthy, charming CEO of Kachitek, I didn't fall for his money. I fell for the man who brought suya and pure water to my kiosk every Friday, who listened more than he spoke, and who smiled like he had found something rare whenever he looked at me. But love stories don't always unfold in fairy tales. Sometimes, the villains are not monsters hiding under your bed, they are family members smiling at the dinner table. I met Emeka when I was selling snacks and phone accessories outside the university gate. He had a rough beard, sharp eyes, and a quiet manner that made him stand out from the rest. I didn't know he was a tech entrepreneur at the time. He was dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans. No air. No pride. Just vibes and patience. 6 months later, he proposed with the simplest ring. No camera crew, no crowd. Just him kneeling in front of my stall, under the rain, with tears in his eyes. That was enough for me. We married 2 months after. It wasn't the wedding of the year, but it was sincere. His parents were surprisingly warm, but his sister, Chioma, was ice from the start. Chioma always watched me like she was searching for cracks in my character. Every smile she gave was plastic, every compliment laced with poison. She called me the kiosk queen behind my back and once told Emeka at dinner, "You know, some girls wear humility like perfume, just enough to deceive you until they get what they want." I laughed it off. But words cut deeper when they're whispered in rooms where you don't belong. When Emeka made me a shareholder in his company, I was shocked. He trusted me with 30% of the business and even let me start overseeing a few small departments. I never asked for it. In fact, I felt unworthy, but he insisted. Chioma didn't take it well. "She's not even educated," she screamed during one family lunch. "Mummy, Daddy, how can he give her part of our family's legacy? She's only here for the money." Emeka stood up for me. He always did. But I could see the poison had begun to spread. His uncle started asking questions. His mother started suggesting business arrangements instead of love. Slowly, I felt like a trespasser in my own home. That's when I decided to give them what they wanted, but not the way they expected. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I told Emeka, "I want to transfer my shares to Chioma." He blinked. "Why?" "Because it's time to prove something." He didn't like it, but he trusted me enough not to fight. Chioma's laughter was loud enough to shake the windows when she received the legal documents. "See? I told you. You see how quick she gave it up? That's what gold diggers do. Once they see the pressure, they run." I watched her gloat at the next board meeting. She started acting like the queen of the empire, walking into offices she'd never visited before, making demands, firing staff who didn't greet her loudly enough. It was as if the power she always wanted had finally arrived. But here's the thing about power. It reveals your truth, not your strength. Chioma had no business sense. None. Within 3 months, she had made 2 disastrous decisions. First, she approved a tech merger without due diligence, losing the company over 180 million Nigerian nairas. Then she changed the company's core product strategy to something flashy and unnecessary because a TikTok influencer said it was the future of gadgets. Investors panicked. Staff morale dropped. Clients began pulling out. The board called for an emergency review. This watched. It was the same people who once whispered I was just a kiosk girl, who now started asking, "Where is Adanna? She used to handle this better." Some even emailed me privately, "Please, can you advise us? We trust your vision." Meanwhile, Emeka said nothing. He just held my hand and said, "They'll see." And they did. One rainy evening, Chioma showed up at our doorstep. She was soaked, makeup ruined, and trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization that her arrogance had cracked the empire her brother built. "You set me up," she cried. "You did this to make me fail." I looked her straight in the eye. "No, Chioma. I did this so you could prove me wrong. But you didn't. You proved yourself wrong." She collapsed on the couch, sobbing like a child. I just thought you were a threat. she admitted. You came out of nowhere, and suddenly he listens to you more than anyone else. I was scared of losing everything. I nodded. You didn't lose it to me. You lost it to your pride. The next morning, I attended the board meeting, for the first time in months. The room fell silent when I entered. I didn't speak long. I never asked to be part of this company, I began. I only ever wanted to support my husband, not take over his legacy. But when trust is given, it must be honored. Power is not a crown. It's a responsibility. And unfortunately, some of us were never ready to wear it. I paused and let those words sink in. I'm willing to return, but only if we start treating people based on their value, not their past. They reinstated me. Not because I begged, but because even pride knows when it's outmatched. Chioma resigned from her position a month later and started therapy. Emeka and I continued to rebuild the company, this time stronger, more united, and with clear boundaries. The truth is, people will always assume the worst when they can't understand your worth. But sometimes, the best way to silence them is to let them take your place and fail where you would have thrived. Now, I walk into every boardroom not just as Emeka's wife or the former kiosk queen, but as a woman who didn't need to shout to prove her worth. I just gave them the microphone and let their own noise bury them. Sometimes, proving them wrong doesn't require fighting back. It requires stepping aside and letting their ignorance collapse under its own weight. The company slowly began to recover. But the damage Chioma had done left more than just financial wounds. It left a deep fracture in the trust between departments, investors, and leadership. I returned to Kachitech not as a victim seeking validation, but as a woman determined to rebuild something broken. I implemented one of the first changes the staff had been silently hoping for. I created a department-wide listening week, where every employee, from the janitor to the junior analyst, could submit ideas and concerns anonymously. What I read shook me. Some employees had been overlooked for promotions for years because they weren't connected. Others had suffered quietly under toxic supervisors. The company culture Chioma introduced, favoritism, elitism, fear, had left scars. I didn't waste time. I started by reversing several of Chioma's reckless policies. I reached out to lost clients with personal letters, taking responsibility and offering reconciliations. We restructured the merger she botched and salvaged what we could. Slowly, trust returned. Emeka remained quietly supportive throughout it all. He never tried to outshine me or reclaim the spotlight. "You're doing what I couldn't," he said one night as we sat on the balcony watching the compound lights flicker in the distance. "You're healing what my family broke." That statement lingered in the air like smoke. Neither of us said anything more for minutes. We didn't have to. But peace doesn't come without resistance. Chioma wasn't finished. Though she had resigned from her official position, she began stirring whispers again among some of the old board members. Those who still felt a woman with no university degree didn't belong in the top tier of one of Nigeria's fastest-growing tech companies. "She's an emotional decision-maker," one man said in a private board chat I was forwarded. "The company needs strategy, not charity." Another board member, Chief Orokwe, requested an official vote to restructure the leadership again, essentially to push me aside. They wanted to hand the reins to an external consultant Chioma recommended, a man who had no connection to the company's values, but plenty of corporate pedigree. I knew this was not just about business. This was about image. They saw a woman who rose from a roadside stall and felt threatened. But I had learned something powerful: truth doesn't need defending. It needs demonstrating. Before the board could finalize their decision, something happened I didn't expect. The staff revolted, quietly, then loudly. Letters flooded the board. Signatures. Testimonials. Even a few former clients wrote in, insisting I was the reason they had returned. The head of logistics, a man who barely spoke at meetings, stood before the board and said, "I've worked here for 10 years. And I've never seen this much dignity given to people like me until Madame Adanna stepped in." The attempted coup crumbled before it could stand. Chioma's final attempt to remove me was crushed not by corporate policy or legal force, but by people who had seen the truth up close. A few months later, I invited Chioma to lunch. Not to gloat, but to free us both. I'm not here to fight, I told her across the table. She looked thinner, more tired, less loud. I was wrong, she whispered. I nodded. I know, but you can still find your own path. Just stop trying to steal someone else's. That day, we didn't hug or make grand speeches. But something subtle shifted. The war was over, not because I won, but because I no longer needed to prove I had. Months passed, and life found its rhythm again. The office corridors buzzed with fresh energy. New clients joined, old investors returned, and for the first time in years, the company began to feel like a family rather than a battlefield. But the change wasn't just in the business, it was in me too. I used to carry myself like I had to shrink to be accepted, to be tolerated in rooms where others had degrees and pedigrees. But now, I walked with my head held high, not out of arrogance, but from a deep awareness of my worth. I was no longer just Emeka's wife, nor the girl from the kiosk. I had become a symbol for every woman who had ever been underestimated, talked down to, or cast aside. It wasn't just about proving Chioma wrong anymore. It was about proving to women watching, those in shadows, in villages, in markets, in corporate trenches, that silence isn't weakness and humility isn't ignorance. And then something unexpected happened. One morning, Emeka walked into our room, holding a brown envelope. This came from Chioma, he said with raised brows. I haven't opened it. I took it slowly and unsealed the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A formal letter renouncing the shares I had transferred to her. At the bottom, a note in her own handwriting. Sometimes, it takes holding power to realize you're not ready for it. You were always stronger than I was willing to admit. I'm sorry. I stared at the letter for a long time. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Chioma wasn't just giving up the shares. She was finally acknowledging the truth that leadership isn't about control. It's about service, humility, and courage. The very things she once mocked in me. Later that week, Emeka and I attended a community outreach program we had both initiated, focused on training young women from rural areas in tech and entrepreneurship. We stood before a crowd of over 200 girls, some barefoot, some holding notepads as if their lives depended on it. I told them my story, how I once sold snacks outside a university gate, how I was called a gold digger, how I gave up shares just to prove I didn't need them to lead. One girl, maybe 15, raised her hand and asked, "What kept you going when everyone looked down on you?" I smiled, because I knew who I was before they told me who I wasn't. They clapped, not out of pity, but with the roaring affirmation of girls who had just seen their future take shape. In the end, it wasn't the money, the shares, or even the company that defined me. It was the journey. From ridicule to respect. From shadows to leadership. From being accused of greed to becoming a guardian of legacy. And to anyone still wondering if I was only here for the money, I'll say this. Sometimes, the richest thing you can give is your silence, and let the truth speak louder than your defense. True strength isn't shown by holding on to power, but by knowing when to let go. In a world quick to judge by appearances, character will always speak last, but loudest.